Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to the first episode of the podcast. Today we kick off with the first of 4 episodes looking at the Household Brigade at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. In this first episode we'll be talking about the 1st Regiment of Life Guards. First we'll talk about the men and who they were, then we'll look at the regiment's role in the Waterloo campaign, the part they played in defeating the French army and the stories of certain individuals, and then finally we'll talk about the aftermath of the battle. First Life Guards were numerically the 1st regiment of the British Army and were and still are responsible for protecting the royal household and have always played an important ceremonial role. In an age before the advent of a police force, the cavalry also frequently played a role in breaking up meetings and demonstrations and suppressing riots. In 1810 they had fought on the streets of London in what came to be called the Burdett riots, and earned the nickname the Piccadilly Butchers after a member of the public was killed. However, it wasn't all parades and keeping public order in London. 2 squadrons of the regiment had served in the Peninsula from 1812 to 1814, and many of these men also fought in the Waterloo campaign. So what do we know about the men of the 1st Life Guards? Let's start with where were they from? Now, the British Army at Waterloo was predominantly English, and the 1st Life Guards was very much so, with 88% of the men born in England. Recruited largely from the north of England, almost a third of the whole regiment were Yorkshiremen. The breakdown by nationality can be seen here. So, of 256 other ranks in the 1st Life Guards at Waterloo, 223 were English, 19 Scottish, 5 Irish, 2 Welsh and 2 foreign. The 2 foreign men, by the way, were Private Moses Hercod or Herwood from Bern in Switzerland and Private Gottfried Molt from Hanover. The 223 Englishmen comprised 88 men from Yorkshire, and then, as you can see, 41 from Lancashire, 13 from Cheshire, 9 from Devon, and the remaining 72 men were spread widely across 26 different English counties. What else do we know about these men? The British Household Cavalry at Waterloo would have been an extremely formidable, if not almost bizarre, sight, as these men were, by the height standards of 1815, absolute giants. In a period when, in the average population, fewer than 2 men in 100 were 6 foot tall, a staggering 107 men, 43%, in the 1st Life Guards were that height or taller, with 75% of the regiment being 5'11" or over. As well as being tall, the Household Cavalry also contained many famous pugilists and wrestlers, celebrities of their day from the world of bare-knuckle boxing. While we'll hear in the next episode of the 2nd Life Guards' famous boxer, Corporal Shaw, the 1st Life Guards had in their ranks a man just as famous in the day, William Thorne, 6'1" from West Buckland in Devon. Initially, he was reported killed in the local press, but on the 31st of June, the Bath Chronicle was happy to correct this.
The adjutant of the 1st Life Guards has contradicted the account of the death of Thorne, the celebrated Devonshire wrestler. He is living, ready to perform more feats of valour, and has not even been wounded.
So, the ranks of the Household Cavalry were filled with men who were not only freakishly tall, but were also intimidating, broken-nosed bruisers. It can't be overemphasized how extraordinary they must have appeared and the daunting effect they must have had on the enemy, like a hybrid of basketball team with prize-fighting heavyweights. Then add to that height a large bronze-crested Grecian helmet to further increase their intimidating stature. These were sword-brandishing giants mounted on large black horses, fresh from London, and their sheer size and power must go some way to explaining their devastating impact they had on the heavy French cavalry which opposed and outnumbered them. While most other nations' royal or elite cavalry would have been dressed in all manner of decorative finery, of intricate lace and braid, there was something almost brutally workmanlike about the relatively plain red tunics of the Life Guards.
One point that should be made is that we always read about British household cavalry being mounted on huge black horses. But in fact, when we look at the records, we see this was only relative to the time. The majority of horses in the first Life Guards were under 15 hands, and this would be small by today's standards. Modern British police horses being generally around 17 hands. For some reason, the second Life Guards had larger horses with only a handful under 15 hands, but still they had none larger than 16.
A date of birth is recorded for 252 of the regiment's other ranks, giving an average age of 25 years, so born in about 1790. The oldest man in the regiment was Corporal of Horse William Allen, born in 1766, which would have made him 49, among one of the oldest men in the British Army at Waterloo. The youngest was Private James Knowles, aged just 17, and he was killed in the battle. In terms of length of service, as shown from the data below, by far the most common years of intake to the regiment was 1812 and 1813, those 2 years accounting for 104 men, that's about 41%. This means that the majority of men had, prior to Waterloo, already seen active service abroad, with the 2 squadrons of the regiment which served in the peninsula from 1813 to 1814. The most recent recruit was Private John Torrin, who had joined as recently as 4th of January 1815, while the longest serving was Corporal Joseph Wilkinson, who had enlisted on the 13th of August 1788. On the 17th of April 1815, stationed at Hyde Park Barracks in London, the regiment received a letter from Harry Calvert, the Adjutant General of the British Army.
I have the Commander-in-Chief's command to signify the pleasure of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent that 2 squadrons of the 1st Regiment of Life Guards, each consisting of 100 rank and file with a due proportion of officers and non-commissioned officers, may be held in readiness to proceed on foreign service on the shortest notice.
On receipt of the letter, there was a flurry of activity at the regimental headquarters at this exciting news that they had been called upon to have another crack at Napoleon. Officers were called back from leave, and an order was placed to ensure that, as well as his sword, each trooper would be equipped with 2 pistols. A squadron comprised 2 troops of around 50 men, so this meant 4 troops would embark for Flanders. These were commanded by 4 captains: John Berger, Edward Kelly, Montague Lind, and John Whale. In overall command was Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Ferrier, a Pembrokeshire man, aged 43. So, to battle. May and early June were spent in manoeuvres and parades in Flanders, and some horse races between officers. Suddenly, on the night of the 15th of June, news came through that the French army was closing in, and the whole Allied army frantically scrambled to meet it. The Household Brigade took no part in the Battle of Quatre Bras on the 16th of June, due to arriving too late, around 8 p.m. But during the retreat through Genappe on the 17th of June, the following day, the regiment was called upon to charge a formation of lancers, the vanguard of the pursuing French army. The 7th Hussars, Lord Uxbridge's own regiment, had already tried and failed to drive the lancers from the village and had been withdrawn. Uxbridge then called upon the 23rd Light Dragoons to attempt the task. This regiment refused to charge, and Uxbridge furiously ordered them to clear out of the way, calling,
"The Life Guard shall have this honour!"
He later wrote of what happened next.
2 squadrons of the 1st Regiment, gallantly led by Major Kelly, came on with right good will, and I sent them in to finish the lancers. They at once overthrew them and pursued them into the town, where they punished them severely.
A witness from the onlooking 7th Hussars recalls,
Lord Uxbridge brought forward the 1st Life Guards, who made a splendid charge and drove the cuirassiers and lancers pell-mell back into Genappe. The Life Guards, charging downhill with their weight of men and horses, literally rode the enemy down, cutting and thrusting at them as they were falling.
In the midst of this terrible carnage, Captain Edward Kelly killed an officer of the French lancers, dismounted, and hacked off the man's epaulets as trophies. In a letter he wrote to his wife from Brussels after the battle, he described this incident.
I had the good fortune to kill their colonel myself and one of their privates, when our corporal major came up and joined in time to save my life.
This corporal major was William Bishop, a Sheffield man and Peninsular veteran, aged 36 in 1815. He was later wounded in the fighting.
Another witness remarked upon an almost comic effect of the lifeguards being so well trained in their ceremonial duties. On being unhorsed during the fighting, some lifeguards were seen hurriedly leading their horses to the rear, as they had been trained to do if they fell into the mud on parade in Hyde Park. In stopping the French pursuit at Genappe, the first lifeguards played a key role in allowing the Allied army to retreat to Waterloo. The bottleneck at Genappe, with narrow streets and a single bridge over the river, meant it was the natural place for the cavalry to turn around and stop Napoleon's army from pursuing too closely. And after the failure of the 7th Hussars and the Light Dragoons to stop the oncoming French cavalry, it was the first lifeguards who got the job done. The first lifeguards therefore had a key impact on both the 17th and 18th of June, something no other British regiment can make claim to. If we take rear echelon men and casualties from the 17th of June into account, the regiment at Waterloo is likely to have numbered less than 200 sabres. The heavy rain of the 17th of June created such a quagmire of mud that most depictions of soldiers at Waterloo and their pristine uniforms must be hopelessly inaccurate. Assistant Surgeon James describes the regiment on its return from Genappe.
I saw the regiment coming back so covered in black mud that their faces were hardly distinguishable and the colour of their scarlet uniforms invisible.
So in the morning of the 18th of June, these mud-caked men formed on the right of the Household Brigade. At Waterloo, the Household Brigade was hidden from view and harm behind the ridge which ran, roughly speaking, from the two farms of La Haye-Saint to Hougemont. After the battle began with a heavy French bombardment, the French launched its opening massive attack around 1 or 2 o'clock, sources vary, on the Allied centre. A vast column of French infantry regiments marched towards the Allied line, drums beating. To their left, the west of the battlefield, a huge body of French heavy cavalry trotted forward in their support to protect them. On they came. At a crucial point, as the combined French attack neared the Allied line, Lord Uxbridge launched a massive counter-cavalry charge, comprising both British heavy cavalry brigades. The Household Brigade falling onto the French cavalry, while the Union Brigade came up over the crest of the rise and crashed down into d'Erlon's corps of infantry. The two brigades attacked simultaneously and mingled where their flanks overlapped. In this mass charge, the 1st Lifeguards fell upon Dubois' 1st and 4th Cuirassiers, heavy cavalry on heavy cavalry, fighting on the plain to the west of the farmhouse La Haye-Saint. Their French opponents, the Cuirassiers, wore a steel cuirass on both their fronts and backs. Witness accounts describe the deafening sound of the British swords on these cuirasses as being like blacksmiths working at the forge. Corporal Richard Coulter from Barrasford in Northumberland wrote home in a letter,
"If you had heard us the first charge we made on the 18th, you'd have been reminded of Mr. Greenwood's brazier shop, such a rattling of swords about their backs and helmets. It really was laughable. I received a cut on my bridle hand and had a sword run through my jacket in the shoulder, but it did not touch my skin. My horse had his eye almost cut out."
Despite being outnumbered and facing experienced French troops, the 1st Lifeguards overcame the opposition. As previously mentioned, the sheer gigantic size of the men, presumably being a major factor in hand-to-hand combat. The French fell back. However, all witness accounts of the charge agree that men and officers alike became so excited with their initial success that, instead of halting and regaining vital formation, they carried on too far. Broken up and disordered, they attacked in all directions, chasing whatever foe caught their eye. This had been a common vice of the British cavalry in the Peninsular War in Portugal and Spain, turning victory into defeat by an inability to stop and reorganize. Aristocratic officers who'd all grown up with the thrill of the fox hunt at full gallop invariably got carried away and lost their heads. Lord Uxbridge later wrote,
I had in vain attempted to stop my people by sounding the rally, but neither voice nor trumpet availed.
Napoleon's reserve of French cavalry was not so green, and when the Household Brigade's men were in utter disorder and their horses blown, a vast swarm of fresh French cuirassiers, chasseurs à cheval and lancers was unleashed upon them. This might not have been so catastrophic if the brigade had had a reserve to now protect them. But the Horse Guards, the Blues as they're often called, who had been intended as the brigade's reserve, had not wished to be left out of the glory and joined in the charge with the other three regiments. This so-called reserve was now in pretty much the same disjointed and scattered state as the other three regiments. In the warfare of this age, being able to line up in a cohesive formation was everything, and failure to do so was fatal. Hopelessly outnumbered, it was the British cavalrymen's turn to be slaughtered. It seems that the 1st Life Guards did manage to do somewhat better than their sister regiment, the 2nd Life Guards, in eventually escaping back to their own lines, but we'll cover that in more detail in the next episode. In the afternoon of the battle, during the massed French cavalry attacks, the sad remnants of the Household Brigade were drawn up near their original position in support of the Allied infantry squares, and were again called upon to countercharge the advancing French cavalry. The Household Brigade still suffered further losses from the heavy fire it received when attacking a column of French infantry to the right of the line later in the day. Corporal Richard Coulter again.
Towards night, I had my horse shot in a charge against a solid column of infantry. I had my legs out of the stirrups to quit, but another horse came upon me and dropped dead upon my legs. This was about 20 yards from the face of a column of 1,500 or 2,000 men. I struggled to get clear. They saw me and sent some musket shot at me, but they struck in my horses. I squatted down with my head, but was almost breathless. My poor horse had a great many of balls in him, but struggled to extract himself. By this means I got my legs clear, looked over his neck and saw more approaching to Genappe. I mustered all my strength and run off faster than ever in my life. Their flankers fired after me. I tumbled down, but now their shot was spent. I up again and got clear to Waterloo.
By the end of the battle, any men who were still with a horse and able to ride formed up as a makeshift squadron comprised of the sad remnants of both the Household and Union brigades. On the final advance, this makeshift force pressed forward until around 9 o'clock they halted and bivouacked. In a moment, we'll look in detail at the experiences of the men of the 1st Life Guards, but first some general observations. In the absence of written witness accounts, a study of the men's wounds paints a picture which is actually quite vivid and revealing. Multiple men of the 1st Life Guards were discharged from the army later, due to being crushed in a fall from their horse at Waterloo, or due to fractures and crushing from being ridden over by the subsequent ebbing of tides of horses. Cavalry riding back and forth over the battlefield where they lay helpless on the ground. With so many thousands of horses and also artillery limbers and ammunition wagons moving across was an extremely narrow battlefield. Lying wounded on the ground was an extremely dangerous place to be. The number of men discharged later due to either crush or fall injuries is actually fairly similar to the number of men who received sword or gunfire wounds. It's also interesting to see a number of men with lance wounds. These might have been received on the 17th of June at the fighting in Genappe, but many would have been received as the unorganised British cavalry desperately tried to extricate themselves from the disciplined French counterattack. This fate befell all the heavy British cavalry regiments, not only the 1st Life Guards, and we'll be hearing the same story in the next 3 episodes of this series, and when we look at the Union Brigade in the future sometime. Witnesses described small groups of individual British cavalrymen being pursued by clouds or swarms of light French lancers on their smaller, faster horses, often sticking their lances multiple times into the backs and arms of their prey. It's interesting to note, though, how, while an effective weapon in this scenario, the lance, which wasn't employed by the British Army at this time, seldom seems to have inflicted a fatal wound, and evidence shows Allied soldiers often received multiple lance wounds, but recovered. So from the total of about 250 men on the 16th of June, by the end of the 18th of June, 30 had been killed and 72 wounded. That number, 72, is only those with confirmed documentary evidence. It's possible, very possible, that that number is even higher. So now let's look at the 4 troops of the 1st Life Guards and the kind of casualties they suffered. See if that tells us anything about the battle. First, Berger's troop. 4 men killed, 21 wounded. Private James Law, a Rochdale man, was later discharged in consequence of being
wounded above the left hip and contusion on the belly by a piece of shell and severe injuries of the chest and loins, having been rowed over by a column of cuirassiers in a charge.
Similarly, Private Thomas Richdale was discharged due to
inward injuries from having been rowed over at Waterloo.
Next, Kelly's troop. This troop suffered the least casualties, with 7 men killed and 12 wounded. Captain Edward Kelly, who we've already heard about jumping down to chop off the epaulets of the French officer he'd killed, was later so badly injured in the fighting that he was shipped home to England. The wrestler William Thorne was in this troop, and we've already heard he survived unscathed. A Private John Lees in this troop was shot in the thigh with a musket ball and consequently discharged in 1816, still aged only 21. Interestingly, at the Peterloo massacre in Manchester in 1819, there was particular outcry that one of the victims, a man named John Lees, had been a soldier who'd served at Waterloo. This man, who died in Manchester after his wounds 3 weeks after the Peterloo massacre, was reported by a witness to have said,
"He said he was never in so much danger at Waterloo as he was at the meeting. For at Waterloo it was man to man, but at Manchester it was downright murder."
Now, Private John Lees of Kelly's troop was, interestingly, from Manchester, and even more interestingly, a witness at Peterloo describes that John Lees raising his stick to keep off the blows of the special constables. So why was a man in his early 20s carrying a stick? Surely because it's the same man wounded in the thigh at Waterloo. This would be extraordinary to have identified the exact man murdered in Manchester by the magistrates at Peterloo, and to have confirmed a legend that one of the victims at the meeting in St. Peter's Fields was a Waterloo veteran. Sadly, however, other pieces of evidence don't seem to fit. It might still be possible. Further research is needed, but personally I don't think this is the same man. What a pity. But back to the Life Guards and on to Lynd's troop. This troop lost the most men killed, 13 either killed in battle or died of wounds, and 15 wounded.
Captain Lynd was among those killed, the only troop commander of the 1st Life Guards to lose his life. He'd been taken ill in the days prior to the battle and had been advised to stay with the baggage in the rear, but had insisted on going forward to lead his men.
Private Joseph Lilly, aged 31, survived the amputation of his left leg. Private James Edmondson, aged 20, lost his right arm above the elbow. Private John Wilson, we'll hear more about him, from Douglas on the Isle of Man, received a lance wound in the shoulder and a fractured skull. Private Henry Barrett from Oldham was shot in the body, but the musket ball was never extracted. On his death, 42 years later, a post-mortem was carried out and a cyst was found in his lungs. On examination of the cyst, the musket ball was discovered inside. Wales' troop suffered the most overall casualties, with 7 killed and 24 wounded. Again, we see fascinating glimpses into the kind of fighting in which these men were engaged. Private Edmund Spicer from Brough in Yorkshire had his horse shot from under him and also received a French lance through his belt, but survived unscathed. Private David Johnson, another Yorkshireman, this time from Duffield, had 3 horses shot from under him, and the injuries he received, presumably on the 3rd fall, eventually led to his discharge as a Lance Corporal in 1818. 3 Lancashire men in this troop, Privates Thomas Gardner, George Horrocks and Thomas Gregson, were also injured from falls and being crushed and ridden over as they lay on the battlefield. It really was like a sort of pile-up at Beecher's Brook, which is almost as dangerous as all the actual sword fighting and being shot at with muskets. And as well as the terrible losses in men, the regiment also lost numerous horses. One return giving 48 horses killed and 25 missing, with a further 21 wounded. When reading hundreds of contemporary letters and memoirs of British officers of the period, it's noticeable how frequently they mourn the loss of their own personal horses, but almost never their men. Captain Kelly, in his letter to his wife, is just one example.
My beautiful bay mare was wounded in the head by a lancer, and I fear she is lost. She carried me beautifully in action, and I would almost prefer being wounded myself to having lost her.
He need not have worried. The mare recovered and outlived her master by 6 years, Kelly dying in India in 1828. Her tail and other relics of Kelly are held by the Household Cavalry Museum. Remounts were sent out from England to replace the losses in horses, and replacement men too. However, even as late as October 1815, the regiment was still battered in appearance, and an inspection of that month noting that
there is a considerable number of carbines and pistols, and some swords likewise deficient, owing to the losses incurred at Waterloo.
Now part of the Army of Occupation in the post-Waterloo months, some men got themselves into trouble. 2 Waterloo men, Joseph Bottomley and John Dinsdale, both Yorkshiremen, were court-martialled in the month after Waterloo for being out of barracks without leave in order to pilfer potatoes from a nearby field. They were sentenced to 2 weeks and 1 week solitary confinement, respectively. More seriously, Private Wilson, who we've already heard received a lance wound and fractured skull at Waterloo, had recovered sufficiently to get himself into deep trouble in August 1815. The Manx man was court-martialled for using threatening language and striking and kicking Corporal Holden. Found guilty by the court, he was sentenced to receive 300 lashes. However, this was later commuted to extra drill and to be confined to barracks for 2 months.
The bravery displayed by Private Wilson at Waterloo, inducing the commanding officer to remit the corporal punishment.
So that brings us to the end of the first Life Guards at Waterloo. The battered remnants of the regiment returned to England and would not serve abroad again until Egypt in 1882. But let's finish just by looking at what became of some of these men after Waterloo. Firstly, what of the widows of those men who did not return? For many there was little to prevent them from falling into poverty, but for a lucky few a compassionate fund provided an annual payment for the rest of their lives, which would certainly have helped keep them from the workhouse. One such relatively fortunate woman was Isabella Gill from Heptonstall, near Halifax. She was the widow of Private John Gill, also from Heptonstall, who was killed in Wales Troop. She does not seem to have returned to their native Yorkshire, still living near the Hyde Park Barracks many years later. The long war with the French now finally over, there was a sudden great upheaval in England as the nation pressed for social change. As we'll see in many episodes of this podcast, a recurrent theme is that the cavalry heroes of Waterloo often quickly became the villains, as they were employed around the British Isles in suppressing attempts by the ordinary working people to gain better living and working conditions and to attain a more equal footing in society. Just as they had been back in 1810, the Life Guards were once more back on the streets as a mounted police force. In late 1816, just 18 months after Waterloo, the rising call for universal male suffrage led to unrest in London in what became known as the Sparfield riots. The Life Guards were called in to break up these meetings and disperse the protesters. Once again we meet Private John Wilson from the Isle of Man, he of the fractured skull and more lately escaping the lash, having walloped and kicked Corporal Holden. This time it's Wilson who confronts a rioter named Richard Simmons, taking a sword from him and later giving evidence at the Old Bailey. The unfortunate Richard Simmons was sentenced to be transported for 7 years. During the funeral procession of Queen Caroline of Brunswick in 1821, crowds, angry at the way she had been treated, rioted in Hyde Park, almost adjacent to the Household Cavalry barracks. This time 2 rioters were killed. In the inquest into one of these deaths, of Richard Honey, Private Thomas Rutherford of Wales Troop at Waterloo was accused of perjury by some jurors for seemingly lying in the cover-up of what had actually happened. Other Waterloo men in the regiment went on to have a happier connection with the royal household. Corporal of Horse William Henry Weaver from Petersham, Surrey, became Queen Victoria's porter at Kew Palace, where he lived with his wife Sophia and his daughter Augusta, who was also a servant in the royal household. Another Corporal Major, Christopher Forge, from Driffield, Yorkshire, became a yeoman of the guard, or beefeater, and served in that capacity for 20 years. So we've seen the men of the 1st Life Guards upholding law and order, but some others amongst them found themselves on the other side of the law. Private William Ryder from Uttoxeter in Kelly's troop in Waterloo was indicted in 1817 for stealing a watch, a seal and some ribbon from Hyde Park Barracks and pawning them. For this he was transported to New South Wales for 7 years, although on checking this there doesn't seem to be a man of this name on any of the transport ships to Australia, so it may be that his sentence was commuted, perhaps for his valour at Waterloo or something like that. While desertion was common in many British regiments of the period, it was rare in the Household Cavalry. However, Private William Rutland, an Irishman from Wales Troop who had been wounded at Waterloo, deserted twice, the first time 2 years before Waterloo and the second time in 1818. Being found guilty a second time would usually have resulted in very serious consequences, but Rutland was allowed to be discharged from the regiment without suffering any punishment. The report stating,
"In consideration of being severely wounded at Waterloo, was discharged without being brought to court-martial."
Private James Joy, a Peninsular veteran from Pateley Bridge in Yorkshire, served another 23 years in the regiment and was finally discharged aged 46 in 1838. He became the park keeper at Regent's Park in London, working there for the next 26 years before dying in Acton in 1870, aged 78. Now, this Waterloo man had a son, John, who, amazingly, fought in the second most famous British battle of the 19th century, being part of the Charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in 1854 in the 13th Light Dragoons. Other men living to a great age include Private William Butterworth, still in Oldham, aged 80 in 1861, William Kirby from Preston, who made the national press in 1875 for marrying at the age of 80 a bride aged 63, and perhaps the last man standing, Corporal John Herdsman from Ellerton near Hull, who was a schoolmaster for 23 years before dying in 1880, aged 87. His obituary mentions that his 5 sons were all over 6 foot, so still something of an accomplishment even then. So that ends the first episode of this series. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. I'll be back next week with part 2, when we'll look in similar detail at the 2nd Regiment of Life Guards. Thank you.